So for me, the idea of trying to take some rational system of measurement to try and come to terms with something that's completely incompatible, I thought was an interesting kind of drama. So,
also a power play for the medical, kind of a medical form of knowledge, in a particular time.
Well, so it's beyond the rational, though, because it becomes, the way that you treat it becomes industrial. This is something Nicole was talking about the resistance of that button. It's not the keystroke on a computer like this, this then sends in a bunch of other things going on. You feel the same way you would if you pulled that lever, I imagine, the resistance of the actual action taking place, which you kind of, you're angling towards it with the story of the other piece, where there was a time at which there was no other option. The rational and the industrial were tied together. But what is drawing you to chasing these ephemeral concepts? Like the idea of the measurement of the breath. Like the breath is, to me, it's clouds. It's things that are out there in the ether. It's not, water jet cut metal, industrial, rubberized grips. Like, what is it that causes that interplay for you?
Well, we talked about this the other day. It's largely my vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I think that just as the man who was weighing people at the time of death was trying to find some sort of quantitative rational system to come to terms with what he couldn't otherwise understand. And so I think that in a larger sense, there's so many things about the way we approach life, metaphorically or literally, comes out of our own personal toolbox. The tools that we have at our disposal, the education that we have, the upbringing that we have, are all our vocabulary. I'm sort of this allegorical tinker and build these things that enact these stories for me. And it's sort of the drama for me becomes in this act of trying to find resolution, limited resources.
It's interesting how it is absolutely your personal vocabulary, right? But as we were talking the other day, I do think some of those vocabularies are shared, and some of them can be quite strange, different to other people. And when I first encountered this work, one of the things that I found interesting about it was the extent, and I think I'm not entirely sure that you agree with this, which is totally fine, but that it seemed to me to be kind of an interesting opportunity to think critically about the state of masculinity, in contemporary culture, and not just because you're male embodied, but because of the industrial vocabulary's relationship with masculinity. And one of the things I've always really admired about your work is the extent to which it, I think, figures alternative masculinities. Like a masculinity that is deeply industrial and ephemeral, that is static and not all at the same time. And isn't the heroic, spear-throwing, Hellenistic sculpture that we were talking about earlier, but is instead this reclined Christ, or this reclined figure, right before the heroic rebirth, right before the kind of culmination of the story. The way that you resist that kind of, there's that word I love so much, but that kind of, that narrative that you can take this vocabulary and bend it in those directions has always been really interesting to me, because often when you see straps and pulleys and things like this, and it's associated with a body and not a working body, it's a feminine body, and that body is strapped in this and that, in all these different ways. So there's such interesting gender play in this for me. I don't know, do you want to give that some thought, or?
Oh boy, that's tough.
No, that's not necessarily your intent.
No, it definitely comes back to identity,
right,
in a way, and I think that, and again, also about this notion of the parameters by which we try to define ourselves. Richard had a wonderful lecture about Duchamp's large glass, and some of the things that we talked about with the Mount of Molds, which is a segment of the Bachelors, which were molds that were used for casting tin soldiers or uniformed men. So not just the uniform that makes the identity, but the interior negative space of the world around that forms So in a way, these notions about identity and about how those roles and parameters come into our lives and affect our lives that are as much a restraint as a safety belt. So for me, the notions of the belt, and of course people instantly go to bondage stuff, and I can understand that, but it'd be really easy for me to go off into sort of fetish stuff but I don't think it would have the same kind of dialogue. For me, the belt and the strap and the restriction has much more been about that idea of something that's as much a safety belt as it is a restraint. You know, how we would strap ourselves into a roller coaster or a car so that we would be secure in carrying out that perhaps tenuous or dangerous kind of operation. So for me, it's much more about the way you strap yourself in a coat or something.
So do you see them as protective?
I see them as protective and also supportive and also limiting. And I think they can be all of those things at once. And it's not so much that I have it's not so much that I'm trying to say one thing is bad or good as to try and look at what are the mechanisms that shape the way we relate to the world and how are those things safety belt as much as a limiting restriction.
So there's that balance again, right? There's that scale, that kind of back and forth between like the production of safety coming in a certain way, all these different things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like being able to work in these grammars, like with metal and straps and the rest of it, and be able to produce figures that don't go to that fetishistic place, that can exceed that ready-made kind of story for them, is actually one of the things that time and time again you pull off in your work in a really interesting way. I mean, like, I don't know how you get a black strap over and over again to kind of do the work that you wanted to do, but you do, and I'm always like, did it again, I mean, I think one of the ways you did it in the back piece, we were talking about this a little bit the other day, almost kind of, or not accidental, I don't want to use that word, I think that's overused in our criticism, but maybe not intentional. Okay, which would be obviously, now that you've made the suit to produce those images and you go back to it and try to figure out how to install it in the gallery, it starts to take on these different kinds of formal qualities. Like we were talking about the addition of the plexiglass and how all of a sudden it opens up to conversations about the Visible Human Project and kind of certain notions of biology in that way. But then also, you made this observation, and I completely agree, that they also like stick pins that you would put in a dissecting, if you're dissecting a body or something like that. Isn't that amazing? And so all of a sudden now, instead of a kind of inquiry into like pleasure and pain per se, it starts to veer towards a kind of conversation about medical knowledge and so not just even industry for that matter, but these other kind of meta discourses that some of these grammars might otherwise preclude. So like that's another intention that I see you often working through. Is that something that you commit to?
I find, I definitely. I find that the medical discourse, which is what led me to the storyline, was weighing people's position, was weighing people's and some of these dramatic stories about, through medical history, I find really compelling, and it has, for me, it really gets back to this notion of sort of a particular kind of feeling of Western culture that and I think it's in other cultures also, that the identity and the personality are somehow part of the spirit of the soul. And for me, I find with my own life coming to terms with how my own physiology changes my personality, which I find to be very alienating in ways. This notion that you could have a drastically different opinion about something from one day to the next seems really strange to me. And the ways our physiology impact who we are. Another thing that fed into the building of this piece is I've been having some golfing done, and the guy who I was working with told me that that the body retains reflexive memory about traumatic events, such that if you experience a traumatic event, when something triggers you, say you're in a car accident, and years later you're in your house and you hear a car accident in the street, your body will reflexively attempt to put itself into the position it was in the last time it experienced that trauma. So I thought, well, what if I made a piece that I physically manipulated the body to simulate a tranquil, esoteric state?
Right.
Could I then induce a tranquil, meditative state by physically manipulating the body to be in that position? And so that's where I came into this idea of measuring the movement and then reproducing it with the machine.
That's interesting. Like in chart, there's this discourse that's supposed to know about the body in medicine, right? And there's this knowledge the body has that you know of, that you've experienced, that you're using your artwork in order to like funnel back through and make available to it.
Thomas, are you contemplating, I mean, as I understand it, this is a sculpture that people experience by looking at it. Are you contemplating this as an experience for other people like you have experienced it? Kind of along the same lines that you just said?
One thing that I find with the vacant figure work is that it lends itself to people's imagination. I mean, at least for me, it may not for other people, but when I see a vacant object that is referential of the body, I imagine what it would be like to be in that. I got that with a scale, with a number of things, and so my intention is to imagine it. And people frequently want me to do performance work in conjunction, and oftentimes it doesn't work for me. I'm much more interested in this idea of a machine and what it can do to your imagination and how it can invite you.
Because this could look like a torture device.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of comments about that.
Not that without the background, without understanding.
My quote from Berger.
I'm from, in Europe, there's different discourse, right? We have an older history, and all these devices started of the Middle East, and then mostly that was executed in the name of attention and whatnot, to which was body, in order to speak out the soul, or I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's my reading.
Yeah, it's definitely something I think about.
There's something very medieval, there's something very ancient about this work. I mean, I know you had your hand up on this, so I'll get to you in a second. But, in conversations that we've had, I know you did mention that like part of the project is also like incorporating different kinds of ancient or sacred kind of geometries into the work and stuff like that, which kind of also not just spend the time and the space of a single breath, but also, bring into that same time zone, so to speak, like all these kind of antiquarian ways of thinking or being. And there is something intensely powerful about that. And I think the fact that we go to places of torture when we look at this is not surprising to me, right? Because that's that place where you bring the body into other kind of time zones, this other kind of space. This space where like you're not making rational judgments, to borrow from your vocabulary earlier, but you're kind of just being, you're telling the torturer what they want to know, or you've released your body into, whatever state it is you wanted to elect yourself into, or whatever.
Well, there's often sort of a prescribed progression or evolution of thought that is supposed to be taking place, and it may be completely unreasonable or unattainable, but there's oftentimes these notions of progression.
And you're jamming that, isn't it? Like by kind of stepping with all these different times and time signatures and things.
Well, I think that oftentimes that previous cultures and older things are often used as validation. And so validation comes in. When I did the scale, I titled it Sarcophagus Scale, and the structure of it is shaped like an Egyptian sarcophagus. And what I was thinking about was those experiments were done in 1908. And around the turn of the century, there was a great fascination with occultism, and in particular, there was reference made to Egyptian culture. Yeah, and this idea that somehow Egyptian culture represented this sort of mysterious pagan authority that was something that could be drawn on, often completely naively and without much understanding, but it was an attempt to draw some validation from something, and I think similarly we get that with neoclassicism, references to Greek and Roman cultures, and it's often the case that history is used as a kind of validation.
Much like when things are in the modern moment, yeah. Also that great Egyptian story, the weight of the soul has to be lighter than a feather in order to everything.
Yeah.
But Andre.
I mean, this and some of your early pieces, Box and the Compass, the sarcophagus scale, and also this one back here, are really, to me, interested in the boundaries of the body, like marking the boundary. So that, I wasn't thinking of pincushion, I was thinking like pins on a map.
Yeah, that would also, yeah.
Right? But what I think is interesting, and I think we should say more about, is that this one, sarcophagus, Box and the Compass, even the one with the weird head with the thing and the thing. Imagine just a black leather strap and metal.
Everybody
You sort of have it. But they have attachments, right? They're sort of not only bounded, but they're attached. And this one is a departure because it is, in fact, not attached. There's a way in which the body is both bounded but allowed its free movement, maybe, through breath. And so it would be interesting if you would explain a little bit about what happens in the sort of Muybridge-inspired pieces, and what you think about this idea of both the boundary and the sort of reaching of the boundary in terms of the physical body having a moment of freedom. Because this, and the sarcophagus, and also the electric chair, that's not what it's called, but imagine wood and straps in the middle, and traps.
You're getting worked over.
Those are really not only bounded and boundary-like, but they trap the person in a kind of sort of physicality. Whereas I think this one is some kind of departure, because without the plexiglass, that would just be a pile of rubber straps, right? So what work is that doing for you?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I thought about how I could go about trying to capture that floating idea. So floating in water is a very free experience. You're on the border, so but you're also very much in a state of freedom. And so I felt like trying to come up with a way of understanding that through these devices. So when I first thought about doing it, I thought about floating a pool in which the camera would be above the water and my body would then be below the water. Well, how would we know what was going on? And I eventually came to the conclusion that I thought it was more interesting visually and more like the Muybridge studies if my body could be seen. So that led to building a water tank in the studio. But I think
Of course it did.
Yeah.
Always take the easy way out. Let's go.
But it was an attempt to try and find some way of placing an index on that free body.
Right, but in this case, the index falls apart, right?
Yeah.
In a certain kind of way. I mean, I know that you're using a kind of number index on these. But in fact, the index becomes meaningless in this situation because there's no boundary, right? You
Well,
can move.
Well, that's a great question.
I had a really interesting conversation with Mark Pauline a couple of years ago when I was working on the scale about whether to put buckles on the straps. I was really struggling with that, how I was going to do that. And his idea was, well, maybe they should be sewn on or something, so like it's not so easy to get out of this thing. You're not getting out anytime soon.